Okay, so yeah, let's begin. Hello everyone, and welcome to our closing panel of our Understanding Deep Learning seminar series. Today we have with us Bruno Gavranovic. He's a PhD student at the Mathematically Structured Programming Group in Glasgow, and he was the one that gave us our last lecture of the seminars. We also have Brendan Fong, Chief Executive of the Topos Institute, founding editor of Compositional and author of An Invitation to Applied Category Theory, which is the main introductory textbook of the field. We also have Carolina Gigarte, lead research scientist at Element AI and associate member of Mila Quebec. Oriol Vinhals, author of Sequence to Sequence, Pointer Networks, WaveNet, AlphaStar, and many other amazing papers. And Yassam Ambari, who works as a research scientist at Google with amazing works on using ideas from physics to better understand the behavior of neural networks. So, hi everyone, and let's begin. Our first question is, will there be a theory of everything for deep learning? Something that explains generalization and the importance of different architecture choices, optimizers, and if you think it will happen, how do you think we will arrive at it? Let's go alphabetically, which in fact is Brandon, not Bruno, but yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to kick this off, and I really look forward to this discussion with everyone and hearing everyone's views on this and other questions. I'll sort of keep things simple. It's a sort of speculative question. As this panel is sort of titled, I think there's many paths or many different ways, many different approaches. We'll sort of hopefully try to understand deep learning and arrive at some sort of comprehensive theory of it. I'm optimistic that there will be one, in part because it's, to me, obviously not an accident that there is, that the deep learning works. There's some structure and we may not understand exactly what it is, but there is something clearly to be understood. And I think there's also a clear need to understand it. It's a powerful tool and it's increasingly used across society. And so if we're to use it effectively and safely, we must arrive at some sort of comprehensive theory for understanding how it works and how we can ensure it is used to benefit people. As for where I would look for my particular approach, again, it's more a personal thing. I think we must try a lot of different perspectives. But I'm obviously, from my lecture, interested or sympathetic to a more structural view. So to ask questions like, what is the conceptual core of or essence of machine learning, of deep learning, and what are the sort of minimal structures needed to perform learning? I think I don't want to steal sort of Bruno's answer, but I think we're moving in a direction that, and Bruno has a very interesting paper that he's presenting next week at the Applied Category Theory Conference that just sort of breaks down the different aspects of learning into sort of some notion of search space, and then some notion of bidirectional information flow, and some notion of gradient descent, or sort of, I guess, a logical perspective on what it means to sort of at least has some sort of derivative. And there's a nice identification of just the logical axiomatic essence of each of these ideas, and showing how it fits together into a common language for presenting a notion of learning, and how it really has all these different models across different types of learning. And I think this sort of work is really important for arriving at a theory of everything, because it at least puts, for example, you referenced, I think, different architectures in your questions, but it puts this sort of stuff into a common language so it can be dealt with within a single framework and simultaneously. But maybe I'll leave my answer there. I'm curious to hear what everyone else says.
Bruno, it's your turn.
Hi. Yeah, first of all, it's a pleasure to be speaking here amongst all these amazing people. And yeah, like Brendan, I'll try to also keep my answer simple. Obviously, we don't know, and it's a big question. I'm sort of rephrasing that question in my mind as really like, that's the abstract goal, but really what it matters is getting our understanding to be more coherent and more integrated with all these different fields. And deep learning is at this interesting intersection of a number of those. And you connect it even to physics, right? And mathematics, and we're obviously it's inspired by neuroscience. So understanding how all these different things fit together, I guess, is what we're aiming here. But that's I'm not really saying much with my answer. And maybe to substantiate a bit more, really what we're doing with Brendan and me and many people, other people in this. And again, I'm advocating this is what I'm studying, this categorical approach, which really emphasizes understanding sort of a functional perspective, if you will, a more sort of, say, compositional perspective, where we can study these small systems, put them together, and get a big system whose behavior we can understand. Obviously, this isn't the case for today deep learning systems. We know all the bits and pieces that are in. We know actually all the bits that are being and all the neurons that are firing, but we don't know the high-level emergent phenomena, how all these things arise, and even in our brains and everywhere. So what we're trying to do is get these composable building blocks, sort of when people say loss function optimizer, and when we put them all together, and then you can do meta learning, you can learn the optimizer. So how can we get a unified picture of learning without any ad hoc things where you say, oh, but now I have to do this, or read the paper and there's all these confusing things. So we seem to be on a good path. Deep learning is amazing because we can do lots of experimenting, gets lots of data. But what's missing now is this unifying perspective where we say what these experiments mean and put it all into a coherent picture. So will there be a lot of theory of everything? I'm definitely not well equipped to answer the least here, but it seems we can make some interesting progress by connecting this to people say deep learning is ad hoc, and in a way it is. And there's lots of interesting modern mathematics that seems completely apt for usage in this case, where we can emphasize what does it mean to have bidirectional flow, like backpropagation, what does it mean to be parametrized, and other things. So I think I'll leave my answer at that, and I'm curious to hear other answers.
So I think I'm next if I got my ABCs right. So I'll echo what everyone else said. It's great to be here with among really some of the key people in the area. So thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so I wanted to make a few key points. So one is kind of related to my recent work that we presented at NeurIPS last year in search of robust measures of generalization. That was building off some actually recent work from Google on fantastic generalization measures. So the key argument in the paper is that when explaining generalization, there will always be a trade-off, right? So for example, the trade-off between kind of the generality of theory and the tightness of the explanation. So either the numerical bound or how well it captures as you go from one environment to another, right? So for example, consider, let's say, VC theory, which is very general, is distribution independent, versus, let's say, information theoretic approaches that I've been working with that are distribution dependent, right? And if we had VC theory explaining everything, then we would have a very general theory that can account for various things. That would be amazing. However, it's not the case, of course. We need kind of more specific theories to actually explain specific scenarios. I mean, the key point that I would like to make here is that I don't think that one theory can exist. I think there will be kind of these trade-offs between the tightness, the explanation quality of the theory, and the tightness of the theory that we have. So maybe kind of we can think more about the, some kind of proto-optimal frontier of theories. So this is kind of one of the key things that come to mind. Now, another thing that arises in my work is that the explanations should be data dependent, should be distribution dependent, right? If we don't have distribution dependence, then it's, again, we'll be probably making these large trade-offs in terms of the tightness of the theories, the tightness of the bands we get. There are a lot of kind of generalization guarantees out there that depend on the norms and so on, but of course, the norms are data dependent, and but maybe the theory is not. So again, we might need to kind of go one level down if we really care about the tightness of explanation. So actually in the talk that I gave here a month or whatever ago, I brought up a few different barriers to explaining generalization in deep learning. Statistical barrier, computational barrier, analytical barrier. And I believe that those still exist, and kind of by uncovering those, either empirically or through other methods, we will be able to also make progress just by identifying kind of where we fall short in terms of explanations. And we are making progress. So, the work I have in mind, for example, is the work by Nagaraj and Coulter that appeared in Europe a couple of years back on saying that uniform convergence may be unable to explain generalization. And they kind of make the point that uniform convergence on its own, at least, it cannot explain generalization in deep learning, right? Which is pointing to an analytical barrier. But again, it's important to recognize these barriers to get past them and to make progress. So we had some follow-up work kind of showing how one can use uniform convergence, but perhaps indirectly via studying surrogate predictors and so on, right? So again, kind of identifying this barrier gives us new analytical methods that allows us to get closer to tight explanations. And I think you were also asking kind of about, what would theory of everything would contain. It's a hard question, but I think, again, based on what's happening in the field right now, for example, the role of overparameterization, the role of kind of niceness of the data, double descent, various limits, all that will probably have to be explained by theory better. That's it for me.
I guess I'm next. I'm not that confident on my alphabetization, but I think I'm next. So if not, please just stop me. Like everyone else, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I guess I'm gonna caveat that myself, I'm not really like a theory expert. I mean, I mostly studied this during my PhD, and then I remember some things, so forgive me for my ignorance, but I do think obviously very deeply about deep learning and what it has accomplished, what it can accomplish, how it accomplishes it. And it's a very interesting post question. So thanks, Joao, for that. And then obviously, like, okay, you ask, will there be a theory of deep learning of everything? And, everyone here probably interprets that differently. So let me maybe first start from how I interpreted that. So somehow the first thing that came to mind, and maybe that shows you a bit, maybe also the last part of the question, which is what would be an attack? I mean, what would be an approach that I think maybe we should try to imitate? So the way I thought about this is the way we kind of prove correctness of programs, right, of computer programs. And that in itself is not a solved problem. And if you think about the complexity of algorithms, it's in my opinion much lower than what we're trying to achieve with the kinds of things we applied machine learning to in many different ways, right? So I mean, if you think of course, sorting algorithms, find prime numbers, and so on, there are very interesting automated ways to prove that a program is correct. Then there's obviously more empirical tests like input-output examples, and then generalization like secret tests, right? So that's how I mapped it a little bit to that. And even in this very discrete case where correctness can be maybe even mathematically specified, it's not an easy field. I mean, again, not an expert, but folks that might know about these things, they know that they can spend PhDs to just prove maybe that an algorithm is correct or that it cannot exist and things like this, right? So in that sense, mapping into this field of computer programs in computer science, I'm skeptical that we're very close, or anywhere close to, of course, like a theory of everything for deep learning. And the reasons indeed are that even the specification of the problems we're trying to do are already very fuzzy to start from, right? So I say, well, find an object, classify an object in an image. Everyone knows the one of the most famous data sets in there. And, even as between ourselves, we'll start disagreeing, etc. So it's just a bit hard to get to like, okay, is this program or is this neural net correct? Will it always generalize? I mean, yeah, the data, I agree, the data distribution is going to be quite critical. Every problem will be maybe have to be treated separately, and that tells me that we're a bit maybe far from this theory of everything, although it is a nice concept, right? So that being said, I mean, I think the way at least I personally operate sometimes, not always, but it's just more bottom up, right? So it's just that there are things that you can observe. There's a few papers that I think intrigued a few people that are more theory savvy in machine learning that were mostly just kind of someone who works in a problem and finds something intriguing, and then they publish the paper, right? And so I think for now, it's a bit of a bottom up where there's some interesting property, obviously adversarial examples being one of the main ones that everyone kind of probably has heard of. And then hopefully theory can explain a bit or can characterize why they exist, bound to the existence of adversarial examples, given some input, some output, norms, weights of parameters, architectures, and so on. But I feel we're a bit far from that. And maybe necessarily so, as I said, the kinds of problems that will eventually apply this technology to, they are maybe even not fully specified and fuzzy in a way that even generalization or strong generalization that's used actually in the context of maybe programming is very clear. What do we mean by strong generalization in neural nets? Okay, like it wrote the program, the neural network, and then this program can proven to be correct. So then it strongly generalizes, right? But it's a very I find it's obviously a super intriguing topic, but I feel we're a bit far. Although posing the question is absolutely valid, I do hope to see progress there. And then once we start breaking down the problem, and I guess we'll see maybe later in the panel which pieces of the puzzle of a deep learning system, losses, architecture, initialization, optimization, etc. Which ones we actually maybe understand better. That's to me like, okay, well, going to be quite interesting to hear again opinions from folks here, and happy to give me my own more practitioner maybe perspective. But yeah, anyways, that's my short-ish answer. Very glad to be here. Glad to see everyone, and yeah, up to the next. I think yes, Man, you're last maybe.
Yeah, also thank you again for the invitation to speak here on this very distinguished panel. I look forward to the discussion. I think a lot of people there were a lot of great previous points, maybe a few other things that come to mind in how I understand theory of everything. So one interpretation of that is sort of something a bit closer to how people construct theories in physics, for instance, where a theory of everything in that setting sort of means that you have a theoretical understanding of the basic building blocks, and then everything else you can kind of sort of derive at different levels of complexity and understand like the emergence of kind of higher level things from the lower level things. I'm skeptical a little bit that we will have something that is as maybe simple as that for these more complex systems. I think there's maybe one of the difficulties is even if your goal is to understand things theoretically, meaning in the sense that like derive an expression or something that has a simple theoretical form in the end, I think that not all questions have such answers. That's like one of the things you kind of distinguish in science. And at least in physics, like the sorts of questions that you try to understand theoretically are ones that where you see maybe some shared property among many different systems, and then you kind of believe, well, because this property is shared and I see it, I see it everywhere, maybe there's an underlying simple reason behind it. But it's not that every question that you ask in that setting will have a simple theoretical answer. Some of them will just have, complicated, messy answers that you can only really know once you run a computer simulation, for instance. So like one example I like to give is very far outside of machine learning, but say in material science or condensed matter systems. Some of those things, if you give me, for instance, two materials, maybe there are some general things I can say about like how the resistance varies with temperature and with magnetic field and things like that, and they follow maybe simple functional forms, and you have some mechanisms in mind behind how that comes about. But if you give me like two very specific materials and ask me, do you think, in this setting, this one will be a better conductor than this other one, maybe I can only know that really until when I actually simulate the problem. So I need to like simulate the many particle Schrodinger equation, do some calculations. That's difficult for me to intuit theoretically, and I really only know until I run the simulation. So I think there are questions like that sometimes it's not totally clear to me which sorts of questions, even in machine learning, go into the first category versus the second. So sort of like model specific questions, data dependent, this kind of ties into Carolina's point. Maybe like there's something more hybrid that you can do, which is like you use theory to drive an expression. That expression is more compact than if you actually wanted to train the model to figure out the answer of like, will it perform well or not? And then you maybe compute that answer. So it still involves, it's some mix of, just an analytic answer versus plus something that you actually need to go and calculate for that particular system. I think some of the more, I'm not an expert kind of in classical learning theory. I think some of the questions there, like can we derive non-vacuous generalization bounds for these models? I think it seems likely, or I would hope that we can answer that question for these sorts of models, given that we've answered it before. But whether like doing that will actually help us understand in a way that we find kind of satisfying and or maybe has predictive power beyond just satisfying a bound, I'm not sure. So maybe another kind of distinction I would make among different theories are some that I think at this point we kind of have theories that have some sort of explanatory power for things that we already sort of know. Like we have some intuition about why different architectures should work well and their inductive biases, and then we kind of form theories that match with that, which is nice. But really, like if you want to test, a real test of a scientific theory at least is that you go out on to other systems, other models, other architecture classes, and you see if that understanding works in that domain. And so I think this question of like, what can you predict in a simple way? What can you predict by doing some computation is not even a question that I think even categorizing the questions or formulating the right question for all the questions that are outside of, as I mentioned, like driving non-vacuous bounds, because that I hope that we will try to answer, or we will be able to answer. But I think in this current age, we're asking also more questions or demanding more things of systems that we didn't demand before. And that, some people want interpretability, some people want kind of an intuitive scientific understanding, and whether those questions will have simple theoretical answers or require computation, and how much, I think is not clear to me, at least.
Okay, thank you very much for all the answers. They were pretty good. Like they make you want to think more about even the question that was posed. And piggybacking a little on what Oriel said, what do you think were like the most interesting advances in, let's say, a theoretical understanding of deep learning in the past few years. And yeah, let's start with, well, everyone seems to be thinking, so that's hard, huh? Yeah, but let's go with Brandon anyway, and we go alphabetical again because, yeah.
Thanks, Joel. I don't know, actually. It's a big question to try and name sort of, I don't know, the most interesting. I really don't feel have a broad enough view of the field to give a good answer. So I might just pass for now. But if I think of something, I'll jump in.
Bruno?
Yeah, so to really get, I'm really curious to hear other answers. I definitely don't feel qualified to answer this. I mean, there's obviously things, the one thing that maybe I was quite surprised by this is this double descent thing, where contrary to usual stories about train and test optimization, sometimes just keeping on trading gets you very interesting results, and somehow the gradient, the stochastic gradient descent in itself has this inductive bias, which does something very interesting and manages to really generalize well. So that's the one thing that comes to mind. But I think I might also just really pass and listen to the answers from other people. And yeah.
Yeah, so I think everyone is probably biased a little bit towards their own field. So I'm definitely very biased. I agree with double descent. I think it's one of the kind of most interesting things that appeared in the last few years. I would say generally the role of overparameterization and understanding interpolation in general. That's another key thing. I would say a place maybe where there has been progress, but hopefully a lot more progress will be made in the next few years is understanding kind of transfer learning. So maybe it's thinking about more about the future. That's one of the things I'm really excited about. Or, various notions of outer distribution generalization, I guess, more generally. I would say, yeah, Samantha's work on kind of, there's scaling clause and things like that, but I'll let her comment on that. Let me think just for another second. Another thing I would add is kind of thinking about various limiting cases. Again, that probably comes to our parameterization, but like NTK type thing. But their more recent work considers not only limits in the increasing width, but also increasing depth and so on. And I'm actually quite excited about those and kind of thinking about what it implies, what implications it has on generalization.
Cool. I'll go next. I really definitely like what's been said. I'll give you a meta answer which relates a bit to this what Carolina said just now. So what I liked, or I think it's interesting that has happened more and more in the last few years, and I obviously categorizing this as theory, probably someone might not feel like exactly happy about it, but I call it like empirical theory, but maybe a much better name is indeed laws, right? So we've seen quite a lot of work that are just from a theory standpoint want to understand something. They don't have the tools to be able to do so because, of course, who can assume convexity these days? Who can assume that the data distribution is Gaussian, or like all sorts of things that that are very limiting. Yet there are then these papers, many of which, so I'm just not going to pick one, but the ones that have been mentioned fall in this category, that just have some hypotheses rigorously tested on a variety of data sets and architectures, and then they come up with a law that has to be maybe explained better by theory. But I really like this trend. I myself am completely kind of, if I ever work on more theory, quote unquote papers, that's the way I think probably I'll contribute the most. So I really like that, and I think it's quite refreshing to see these rather than sort of the papers I remember from many years ago, which there still exist, and I still like them, but that would just come with some hypotheses that are possibly non-realistic, that don't describe the problems we are actually using these models for, and then come up with a result. I think those are fine, but these ones I think are very complementary, very necessary, and I applaud anyone that writes these kind of papers. There's many of them, and picking one, I'm happy to pass for the others, indeed, like others have done here. So yeah, how about you, Yasmin?
Yeah, those are all great answers, and I also I will add only a few things because I very much like the previous answers. I think on the whole, I don't feel super that I have the expertise to comment on some of the progress that's been made on the learning theory side. I think some of the deeper understanding that's come from over-parameterization done by a lot of different people, I think has been nice, at least for breaking kind of things that people said were going to plague us in the old days, like the non-convexity of the landscape, but in fact, like when networks, at least in certain limits, they can be effectively convex and so on. These were kind of nice starting points, again, done by many different people. I want to maybe piggyback a little bit off of Oriol's answer on the empirical side, actually. So I do think we're still in a state where some kinds of questions, there's an interesting set of questions out there that we haven't necessarily uncovered that require some amount of just empiricism, or that's kind of the place to first like pinpoint questions and see across which different systems, how do different things behave. One line of work that I really like is the lottery ticket line of work and connection to sparsity, and Carolina's worked on this a bit, I know. And I think that's been kind of nice in that these are now starting points for interesting theoretical questions, but it has to be investigated pretty thoroughly on the empirical side first before we can really hone down on what how you want to try to tackle the theoretical question. So I think that type of work has a lot of value, and also something that's kind of, that is I think the mixed type of work that maybe Oriol was alluding to, where you have hypotheses, you go and rigorously test them empirically and do something that's kind of hybrid.
Okay, thank you very much again. And we have one audience question. It's from Claude Colomb. And he asks, what about the manifold hypothesis advanced by Francois Chollet? I believe this is the hypothesis that data lies in a low-dimensional manifold, and that's why learning is even possible by our methods. So let's invert. Let's go with Yasmin first, and then.
Could you repeat the question? So the question is, what about the manifold hypothesis?
Yeah, I think it's more like whether you believe, whether you think it makes sense. Like he only asked, what about the manifold hypothesis advanced by Francois Chollet?
Okay, I will give a very biased opinion of just the manifold hypothesis, maybe in general, which I'm going to assume to mean that data that we often train on, or real world data, lies on some low dimensional manifold, which we don't know, but we discover through learning. If that's, I'll take that to be my interpretation. I think this, of course, plays a role in how machine learning models work, but I don't know that it's sort of maybe it needs to be a bit more refined exactly what it means, but it's the sort of thing that I don't find surprising, maybe because I used to work more on scientific, in science problems, in nature in general. Natural systems in general are simple in some certain sense. They have a certain kind of sparsity, and you don't know the basis in which they're sparse. But this alone is maybe not so surprising to me. So it's sort of maybe if it's how this kind of claim about real world data ties in with learning. I think, I mean, I don't know exactly what Francois Chalet had in mind with this, but I think the manifold hypothesis alone, as in like, if I take it to mean models generalize well because data lives on a low dimensional manifold, I think this is not powerful enough to kind of tell us things that we really want to know or refined enough. So it needs to be, and I think it needs a bit more refinement. And as I mentioned, like many systems that I can think of are sparse, have some kind of sparsity, but we just don't know the basis in which they're sparse. And part of this learning game is figuring out a good enough basis that's our starting point on which we can kind of build and learn more from the data.
Okay, I guess if we go reverse, I think it's me. So, well, first of all, I really love manifolds. I just caveat this, like I did an undergrad in mathematics, actually. So when I started to do machine learning, I said, oh, that's it. I'm an expert of this thing. Everyone talks about manifold when I started. So I really like this kind of notion that data can be explained by some sort of low dimensional, low complexity. Maybe manifolds are fairly, they're one way to explain this. Another way that is common is maybe compression, right? So, you know, you can compress and you can explain an image by just kind of, you can think of even like language as a way to compress the image, and that's lower complexity in terms of number of dimensions and degrees of freedom. So I like that view. Empirically, again, I'm an empiricist. Maybe the models that were promising and also powerful in this, that so far empirically have not maybe done so great comparatively to others, that explicitly exploit these are variational autoencoders. I mean, if you know what they are, great. If not, the TLDR is that you get data, you try to compress it onto a few dimensions, which would be probably the ones that move you along, you know, a low dimensional manifold, and then you reconstruct the data, and hopefully under this compressed representation, things get easier to classify and so on. And so far, I mean, there's been many attempts to do this, but these methods have not quite taken off, right? So that's just an observation to just put out there to maybe contest that at least we don't know how to do this yet. And then there's another view, just very different, actually, very different angle to this, which is data manifolds are great if the data is static, but especially nowadays that we're starting to play with, well, let's perturb the data, adversarial examples, etc. You suddenly are in a situation where maybe even if this assumption holds true for data that is maybe untampered, you get users and you can change the data, that hypothesis might not even be true, because an adversary can always add this weird pixel in this position to make it, to basically throw you off the manifold that you've learned so nicely, and then you're off the rails, right? And I mean, we need to account for this. So that's maybe not sure it's going to be very useful to think this way, but certainly there are quite a lot of methods that exploit this idea of compression, right? So I mean, in terms of a principle of compression as for learning, self-supervised learning, and so on, it is a good principle, but again, certainly not a necessary component for the best performance systems out there in terms of empirical results on a variety of data formats.
So I agree with a lot of points made by you guys. So it's my answer will probably really kind of be repetitive in some sense, but I also think that, you know, this view of low dimensional data could be useful for two reasons. One is it could explain generalization as it is, right? In which case, again, I'll agree with Yasemin, it's an empirical question whether it actually does. And that's the one thing that I tend to highlight in my talks, right? We need to go and test empirically that, you know, this low dimensional representation can be linked to generalization. That's what our training algorithms take advantage of. And another reason why it could be useful is maybe for building algorithms. But once again, I think, you know, we kind of have a lot of work on representation learning and kind of a lot of intuition about why lower dimensional representations, simplified representations, and so on, why they're useful. And we're trying to design algorithms that can take advantage of it or can learn meaningful representations. But again, it's like there's still a lot of work to be done. So there's no like definite answer, but this is the key or this is not the key, right? It seems like it's maybe just a start of like further evaluation and further algorithm design and things like that.
Right. So I think it should be my turn. Yeah. So I can try to interpret this question and sort of try to take it maybe in a slightly different direction. And the way I intuitively think about this is when we model, the manifold of all images of a cat. It's in some fixed image size of some dimensions and some colors, right? It's a very high dimensional space, but really, if I'm talking about cats, I just need to tell you a few things, and that idea that I can compress this idea of what a cat is in a few bits along sort of just a lower dimensional manifold is what it talks about. And there's, as people have mentioned, lots of work and lots of things we can ask about it, especially about shifting manifolds and sort of online data and stuff like this. For me, what's maybe the most interesting thing here is what Stanislav Fort presented actually here at this seminar. So it's really understanding this geometrically, because when we go to these high dimensions, all our intuitions sort of fall down in water. And I'd just like to repeat the 3 takes, if I remember them correctly, from the amazing talk he presented, which is that these things are unintuitive. So once, let's say I'm optimizing something and I start from a particular point and then I manage to traverse to the optimal point, around that optimal point, there's going to be a bunch of solutions, and they're all going to lie in this low dimensional basin. But that's one of the insights. The second insight is that from the initialization point to the optimal point, I can linearly interpolate, and there's going to be a clear path which I'm going to be able to take, sort of just by decreasing the loss. There's going to be one of those. So that's like a very surprising thing about these high-dimensional spaces that sort of is and has to be connected somehow to this manifold hypothesis. And I think the third one is that all these low-dimensional basins are connected, but sort of jumping from one of them to the other one, you can't sort of easily optimize. There's too many directions to choose from. So to me, this just shows us that really deep learning is exploiting this somehow, this optimization. And that's why many of the insights in deep learning, like somebody does an interesting experiment and then everybody is very surprised, and then we try to understand what happened. So these are some of the things that I find very interesting, and I think, again, I'm gonna leave it at this.
I guess it's my turn. So I guess I'm hearing sort of both agreement and disagreement around a hypothesis that I don't know whether it was sort of stated precisely in this group. So I mean, I'd love a sort of discussion about exactly sort of the bounds of this position. To me, there's something around a notion of sort of natural or real world data lying within lying on a smaller dimensional space manifold within a higher dimensional thing that seems just obviously true, in that, you know, we construct these variables to measure the world or whatever, and then we have these laws that govern sort of the behavior of these variables, and the space that we allow these variables to vary in is often far larger than the space that results when you've sort of written down all your physical or other laws and said what is actually feasible. And so this, I think, naturally shows up when we say take photos of cats. And I think you observe this also in, you know, what actually happens where the ease of adversarial examples in adversarial text in image classifiers. When you try and deviate from the expected behavior of what is a natural looking image, in really small ways that may not even be noticeable to the human eye, you can easily shift sort of classifications from correct to incorrect or something like that. But I think ultimately the question, the hypothesis needs to have a bit more to it, which is about sort of what we can extract out of it, right? And how it interacts, as people said, sort of empirically with the discipline of deep learning. And I'm not really sure, even if we took the statement to be true that, as I understand it, every data generally lies within a low-dimensional manifold, within a high-dimensional manifold. The whole point is to reliably sort of develop techniques for finding that, and maybe that's what deep learning is, but I'm not quite sure how that statement helps us cash that out practically.
Okay, and now for what will probably be our last question, given time. So the question is there any line of work or paper that you believe that points to a great research direction towards understanding deep learning, but hasn't received enough attention? So there is something like underrated papers, or I'll just give a general, because I have one specifically, which is the minimum description length work, or the intrinsic dimension, which was researched by Rosanne Liu. That she was from Google, from Uber, and now it's from Google. And it's a very interesting paper, and I haven't seen much work continuing it. So yeah, let's do the Yasaman to Brandon order. And
So I think I need a bit more time to think of one that hasn't received enough attention, but I'll mention one line of work that I really like that I think is starting to receive more attention, and I kind of underappreciated or didn't appreciate as much when I first heard about it. It's not about it's about distribution shift, and this also was an example I wish I had thought of when we were talking about the empirical science sort of style of work. There's some really fascinating work out of done by folks at Berkeley, a number of different papers where they constructed new data sets that were supposed to be distributed, that they intended would be distributed as according to the original distributions of ImageNet and C410. And the purpose of that work originally was to understand if there had been adaptive overfitting. But one of the really interesting things I think that came out of that with more investigation was just the fact that what they observed after they constructed these new data sets was that there was a very strong correlation, kind of almost perfect correlation, between your accuracy on the new data set and your accuracy on the original. And that this trend should hold at all, across many different models, many different settings of the system is very surprising if you sit back and think about it for a little bit. That you just get one really nice linear trend, and that they have continued to investigate in different settings for other types of maybe distribution shift, not distributed identically to the original data set. And I think that for, at least in the understanding of robustness and distribution shift, that's a very interesting line of work, and something that I think you wouldn't, at least for me, I would never have guessed theoretically again. But really, you have to find this kind of universal behavior empirically. And I mean, this line of work has received attention, but I think it will receive more attention maybe going forward, and I find it very interesting.
All right, yeah, I'll go next. This is a great, by the way, the great question, and actually great question for maybe open-ended to end the panel. So I think, well, first it's hard to find a deep learning area that does not receive attention. So I guess this what I'm gonna say is probably there's a lot of papers and a lot of work on it already, but this is one that maybe is quite interesting and important, and it hasn't received mainstream attention in the sense that deep learning obviously builds a lot of benchmarks, and maybe there's not been a very good benchmark for this particular thing yet. And the thing is, uncertainty, it's a simple concept, really, that most models can't do well, and there's again a lot of work, but the idea is, well, I have an ImageNet classifier and I'm gonna give you an image and it does not contain any of the 1,000 classes, right? Now your model, or a human rather, would say, well, it's none of the above, right? And this is a very uncertainty and this kind of default class and whatnot. I feel it was more maybe prevalent in machine learning before the deep learning explosion. At least that's my perception. But it is quite important. It might help advance, especially things that I think are quite intriguing still, like adversarial examples and what happens when things don't look quite like the data distribution in the input. And it's a very concrete example where we will need ultimately machine learning systems to be able to tell us when they don't know. And again, there is work, there are some benchmarks, but perhaps not as mainstream as it could be. So yeah, that's one of the hopes, is that someone finds a very good benchmark that people build upon, and I think that might build also very nice tools for from the theory side things as well.
It's a great question, but a hard question, I'll say, and I'm sure I would produce a large list of papers, but kind of concretely, very few things come to mind. I'll also kind of echo what I said earlier, and what you guys mentioned on kind of distribution shift, that I think in general, like, that area has a lot of growth potential. In terms of concrete, underappreciated papers, it's the one that I mentioned earlier that comes to mind first, which I thought would receive a lot more attention, is Nagaraj and Coulter work on uniform convergence may not explain generalization. I guess I expect to see kind of a lot more follow-up on that. Maybe it's coming. And I just had another one in mind. Let's see. No, totally forgot, but if I might add at the very end if I remember. But there was another paper that kind of came to mind, and I thought that there may be a lot more follow-up work on that. So I'll add at the end.
So any line of work or a paper that points to a great research direction. So that's a tough question, and it's quite tough to answer. I'm very biased to a particular sort of thing here that I mentioned before. I'll try to frame it a little bit better. So there's been I'm doing category theory, right? And this is this field which sort of originated in mathematics, in abstract mathematics, but now has started spreading out through chemistry, through electrical engineering, database theory, of like lots of quantum physics, like a number of things people study in various different fields are studied in different languages. Deep learning has their own languages. TensorFlow is built on top of something, or PyTorch or JAX. Each subfield has their own different language with their own different diagrams, and it's all very disjoint. So what I would say is the line of work that points to a great research direction is the one that sort of tries to, it's not really related to deep learning per se, but it's really related to understanding how it interacts with all these other different fields. And that's what I've been mentioning. So recently there's been like a boom in this applied category theory stuff, which really connects a number of different fields in maybe a way that's really tough to explain right now in a minute. So that's what I would say is like the long game, I would say, for deep learning, and it's more of a long game for general scientific endeavor of understanding things in small building blocks, which you can compose into bigger ones and understand sort of without any emergent effects, or control the emergent effects. And that's not the case with deep learning. There's all this stuff, and people have mentioned interesting things. So I'm putting it a slightly different perspective. And I think that's it. I might leave it to Brandon, who I assume might have a similar perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, I have a similar perspective to Bruno, and I'm really interested in the notion of understanding of deep learning, which is how it involves how it interfaces with things like neuroscience or economics or some other notion of system, or the various notions of system, both informal and formal, biological and or natural and constructed, engineered. And I think there's the practical understanding and sort of embodied understanding to be gained there, and I'm really looking forward to that being explored. Since I have half a minute, take it in a slightly different direction, which is that I think one way of understanding deep learning is to try and provide sort of technical ways of saying, you know, if we begin with this model or something, can we predict and this data, can we predict it will have certain properties or behave in a certain way? But sort of going back to Bruno's answer, I think another way of understanding deep learning can be sort of, we have this field, we have these techniques, how do we understand what its impacts will be on society? And I don't think this is understudied. Well, I do maybe think that it deserves a lot of attention. I mean, for example, since the question asked to name the paper, the paper, which goes in my mind by stochastic parrots, which received a lot of attention, came to mind. But I would still like to see that sort of direction of research develop further. So that's what I mean.
Carolina, do you remember the?
I did. I also actually wanted to add it. So you mentioned MDL paper. I'm not sure which paper you're talking about exactly, but there's also some older work, of course, by like Hinton and Camp from, I don't know, 1990s. And also all the PAC-based theory is extremely connected. And there's quite a bit of work on that, some work that I published a few years back, but of course a bunch of work by others as well. So for anyone actually interested in MDL, I think it's worth checking out kind of all the PAC-based theory and this older work too. And the paper that I actually remembered was on conditional mutual information by Stankin Sakintinu. I'm sorry if I'm totally mispronouncing the name, which is, I think, a really cool paper and kind of proposes a slightly different notion of information, capturing information theory in the weights based on the data. Anyway, so that's all I wanted to mention.
Okay, so thanks everyone again for coming. Like, it was an honor to interview you in this panel, and hope we can all meet in person in the future. Okay, and that's it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. It's been
Thank you.